"You're coming with me," said the rancher after her in-laws shaved her and left her shamed. Witness this unbelievable, true, inspired story right here on Whisper of the Past. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share where you're watching from. Let's get started. The land stretched endlessly across the Texas horizon, golden fields swaying in the evening breeze, broken only by the dark silhouettes of cattle grazing quietly. In this rugged country, where ranches defined wealth and family names carried weight, lived Sarah Mitchell, a young woman who had always dreamed of building a life filled with love and simplicity. She had been raised by hard-working parents in a small town where honesty and kindness mattered more than money. When she first met Daniel Rogers, the son of one of the wealthiest ranching families in the county, she thought her dreams had finally come true. Daniel was handsome, charming, and seemed to admire her down-to-earth nature. But dreams can sometimes turn into prisons, and for Sarah, marrying into the Rogers family became the greatest mistake of her life. From the moment she stepped onto the Rogers ranch as Daniel's wife, she felt like an intruder in a world where she didn't belong. His mother, Judith, was a cold woman with sharp eyes that seemed to pierce through Sarah every time she entered the room. His sisters, Melanie and Claire, were polished and ruthless, always gossiping, always judging, always ready to remind Sarah that she was not one of them. They never cared for her kindness or her efforts to fit in. Instead, they mocked her small-town roots, whispered about her lack of sophistication, and treated her with subtle cruelty that worsened over time. Daniel, who once seemed protective and loving, grew distant under the weight of his family's expectations. His silence often hurt more than their words. The Rogers family prided themselves on appearances. The ranch was not just a business, it was a symbol of power. Every gathering, every town event, every Sunday at church, they made sure they looked perfect. But behind closed doors, perfection was demanded at a price. Sarah quickly became the scapegoat for every small mistake, every imagined slight. If a meal wasn't seasoned to Judith's liking, Sarah was scolded. If laundry wasn't folded the Rogers way, Melanie and Claire sneered at her. Daniel rarely defended her, brushing it all aside with a dismissive, "They'll come around, just give it time." Time only made things worse. It all came to a breaking point one stormy evening when thunder rolled over the ranch and rain battered the windows. The family had been arguing for weeks about land inheritance and control of the cattle business. Daniel's sisters insisted that Sarah didn't deserve a say in any decisions, even though she worked tirelessly on the ranch alongside her husband. Judith accused her of marrying for money, of being nothing more than a burden. Sarah, exhausted and heartbroken, finally raised her voice and told them they had no right to strip her dignity. That was the last straw. Judith's eyes gleamed with cold fury as she signaled to her daughters. Before Sarah could react, Melanie and Claire shoved her into a chair. Her protests echoed through the house, but Daniel stood frozen in the doorway, saying nothing. With deliberate cruelty, they produced a pair of shears. The sharp metallic snip rang out like a gunshot as the first lock of Sarah's golden hair fell to the floor. She screamed, begged, tried to escape, but they held her down. Piece by piece, they cut until her beautiful hair was gone, leaving her scalp bare, raw, and vulnerable. When they finally released her, laughter filled the room. Judith's lips curled into a satisfied smirk. "Now the whole town will see you for what you really are, nothing." Sarah stumbled to the mirror, her reflection a stranger. Tears streamed down her cheeks as she touched the jagged remains of her hair. Humiliation wrapped around her like chains, tightening with every cruel chuckle behind her. She turned to Daniel, pleading for comfort, for defense, for something that proved he still loved her. But he looked away, his silence heavier than the storm outside. In that moment, something inside her broke. She realized she had no place in this house, no love left in this marriage, no dignity among people who only thrived on her pain. Gathering the little strength she had left, she ran to her room, stuffed a small bag with clothes, and slipped into the night as rain pelted the dirt road. The storm soaked her through, the cold biting against her bare scalp, but she didn't care. She just needed to get away. The road stretched endlessly before her, lit only by flashes of lightning. Her footsteps faltered, her sobs drowned by the thunder. She had nowhere to go, no family close by, no friend she could turn to in the darkness. Every step felt heavier, every memory of cruelty pressing down until she nearly collapsed. She might have wandered into the night forever, lost and broken, if not for the sudden beam of headlights cutting through the storm. A pickup truck slowed beside her, tires splashing mud. The door creaked open, and out stepped Ethan Walker, a rancher from the neighboring property. He was tall and rugged, his face weathered from years of working under the sun, his presence strong and steady like the land itself. Ethan had known the Rogers family for years, though he kept his distance, preferring the quiet honesty of his own ranch over their schemes and gossip. He recognized Sarah instantly, even in her broken state. She froze under his gaze, ashamed of how she looked, ashamed of what had been done to her. But Ethan didn't flinch. His eyes softened as he shrugged off his heavy coat and draped it over her shoulders. The warmth enveloped her trembling body, the gesture more comforting than any words could be. "You don't have to say anything," he murmured, his voice steady against the storm. Then, with a firmness that left no room for argument, he said the words that would change her life. "You're coming with me." Sarah wanted to protest, to tell him she didn't deserve kindness, that she had nothing left. But when she looked back at the Rogers Ranch in the distance, its windows glowing like the eyes of a predator, she realized there was nothing left for her there. Slowly she nodded, her tears mixing with the rain. Ethan guided her to his truck, opened the passenger door, and helped her inside. As the engine roared to life, Sarah looked out the window, watching the Rogers Ranch fade into the stormy night. For the first time in years, she felt a fragile spark of hope flicker within her. Maybe this wasn't the end. Maybe it was the beginning of something new. And as Ethan drove her towards safety, the storm outside seemed a little less terrifying than the storm she had just left behind. The storm faded slowly as Ethan's truck rolled along the winding country road, its headlights carving a path through the sheets of rain. Sarah sat silently in the passenger seat, her arms wrapped around herself beneath the heavy coat he had draped over her shoulders. The warmth was comforting, but her mind was still raw, replaying every cruel laugh, every tug of her hair, every look of indifference from the man she had once trusted to protect her. She felt hollow, as though the storm had ripped everything away, leaving her only with shame and emptiness. Ethan didn't press her for words. He kept his eyes on the road, his jaw firm, his silence steady and patient. He knew when a soul had been wounded, and he knew that sometimes silence could heal better than questions. The hum of the engine and the rhythm of the windshield wipers filled the space between them until finally the truck turned down a long dirt lane that led to his ranch. The Walker Ranch was modest compared to the grand Rogers estate, but it was alive with something the Rogers home had never known: warmth. The lights glowing from the porch were soft and inviting. The scent of rain-soaked earth and hay filled the air, and the faint nickering of horses in the barn carried on the wind. Ethan parked the truck and cut the engine, then turned to Sarah. She hadn't moved, her eyes fixed on her lap, as if afraid to face what came next. "Come inside," he said gently. His voice wasn't demanding but protective, as though he was holding out a lifeline. She nodded, clutching the coat tighter around her as she followed him to the house. Inside, the air was warm, carrying the faint aroma of coffee and wood smoke. Ethan led her to the kitchen, where a pot still sat on the stove. He poured her a cup of coffee and set it in front of her, then pulled out a chair. Sarah sat slowly, her fingers curling around the warm mug, though she didn't lift it to her lips. Ethan took the seat across from her, his weathered hands resting calmly on the table. For a long while, the only sound was the rain dripping from the eaves outside. Finally, Sarah's voice broke the silence, weak and trembling. They cut it all off." She lifted her hand self-consciously to her bare scalp, her eyes filling with tears again.
They laughed.
"They said I was nothing, and Her voice cracked. He just stood there and let it happen. Ethan's jaw tightened, his eyes darkening with restrained anger. He didn't interrupt, didn't rush her. He let her spill the words she had been choking back. "I don't know who I am anymore," she whispered. "They took everything from me. My dignity, my marriage, everything." Ethan leaned forward, his voice steady. "No, they didn't. They tried, but they don't get to decide who you are. And they sure as hell don't get to break you." The firmness in his tone caught her off guard. She searched his eyes, expecting pity, but found only respect and conviction. For the first time that night, she felt something other than shame. It was faint, fragile, but it was hope. That night, Ethan gave her the guest room and left her in peace. Sarah lay awake for hours, listening to the rain fade into silence. She ran her hand over her head, wincing at the stubble, and whispered to herself that she had to be stronger than the cruelty that had tried to define her. Sleep came slowly, but when it did, it was the first real rest she'd had in months. The following morning, sunlight poured over the ranch, spilling golden light across the fields. Sarah awoke to the sound of roosters and the distant lowing of cattle. She stepped outside the guest room, hesitant, but Ethan greeted her with a nod and a plate of breakfast on the table. He didn't smother her with questions or sympathy. He treated her as if she belonged, and that quiet normalcy gave her strength. In the days that followed, Sarah began to find a rhythm in Ethan's world. She helped him feed the horses, learned to mend fences, and even tried her hand at riding again. Each task gave her a small piece of herself back. The dirt under her nails, the sweat on her brow, the simple satisfaction of honest work, all of it reminded her that she was more than the Rogers cruelty. The town soon learned what had happened. Rumors spread quickly, and people began whispering about Judith Rogers and her daughters. Their reputation, once so polished, began to tarnish as neighbors condemned their actions. At church, where appearances had always been their pride, whispers turned into glares. Meanwhile, Sarah's bravery in leaving them quietly earned respect. People who had once been silent now reached out with small gestures, an encouraging word, a warm smile, a basket of food left on Ethan's porch. Daniel came once, weeks later. He drove to the Walker Ranch, his truck kicking up dust as he pulled into the yard. Sarah was mending a fence with Ethan when she saw him climb out, his face drawn with guilt and shame. He tried to apologize, to explain, but his words rang hollow. She listened silently, then shook her head. "When I needed you most, you stood still. That silence will never leave me." With that, she turned away, leaving Daniel standing in the dust. Ethan said nothing, simply placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder as she walked back toward the house. Her shaved head, once a symbol of humiliation, began to grow back. Each week, as the stubble thickened into soft hair, she looked in the mirror and saw not weakness, but survival. She no longer flinched at her reflection. Instead, she saw a woman who had endured cruelty and walked away stronger. Ethan often caught her staring out at the horizon, her eyes no longer filled with despair, but with determination. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky in hues of orange and purple, Sarah sat on the porch with Ethan. The air was warm, filled with the hum of crickets and the gentle rustle of cattle in the pasture. She turned to him, her voice quiet but steady. "You saved me that night." Ethan shook his head. "No, you saved yourself. I just gave you a place to start over." Sarah smiled, the first true smile that had reached her eyes in a long time. For the first time, she felt free, not just from the Rogers family, but from the chains of shame and fear. She realized that the words Ethan had spoken, "You're coming with me," had been more than an offer of shelter. They had been a promise, that she didn't have to walk alone anymore, that she was worth protecting, worth respecting, worth loving. The Rogers Ranch continued on, but their name carried less pride. People remembered what they had done, and their power in the community began to fade. Sarah, on the other hand, found herself reborn in the quiet strength of Ethan's world. She wasn't defined by cruelty anymore. She was defined by resilience. As months passed, her hair grew long enough to brush her shoulders. She no longer hid it beneath scarves or hats. She wore it proudly, a reminder that even when stripped of everything, she had built herself back stronger. She stood tall in town, unashamed, her head high as people greeted her warmly. Life on the Walker Ranch became her sanctuary. She wasn't just surviving, she was living. Every sunrise brought new strength, every sunset carried gratitude. And as she looked out at the vast horizon that stretched endlessly before her, she knew she had finally found what she had been searching for all along. Not wealth, not status, but freedom, dignity, and the courage to begin again. And in that wide open land, beside the man who had spoken the words that saved her, Sarah Mitchell finally reclaimed her life.